Camilla has just faced the single royal blow she always assumed King Charles would never allow. Minutes ago, Buckingham Palace made it official. Charles is stepping back. William is taking charge, and Catherine will stand with him at the heart of the monarchy. Yet that was not the part that left Camilla furious. Buried inside the order was one last instruction, written by Charles himself, that locked her household out entirely. Word of it raced through London within moments. Reporters and camera crews crowded the palace gates. Phones lit up all over Westminster. Senior aides shifted into position before the public even grasped what had unfolded. Inside Buckingham Palace, 2 ceremonial chairs had been placed beneath the royal crest. One for William, one for Catherine. There was no chair for Camilla. Then the doors of the throne room swung open. William came in first, carrying himself like a man who had been handed enormous power before he had any chance to enjoy it. Catherine moved alongside him in silence, steady on the surface but clearly shaken underneath. Princess Anne waited near the front. Charles was nowhere in the procession. Camilla was nowhere at all. Every lens recorded the same picture, and everyone watching understood what it meant long before the palace uttered a single explanation. The future had arrived ahead of schedule. This was no ordinary handover of duties. For months, Charles had worked to persuade the nation that the monarchy was still on solid ground. State papers landed on his desk every morning. Carefully staged photographs showed him hard at work. Palace statements insisted his duties continued as normal. Yet behind that image, exhausting meetings were quietly canceled, long ceremonies were cut short, and William was steadily assuming appearances that once belonged to the king. The breaking point arrived during preparations for a major state ceremony in London. Charles showed up determined to finish the rehearsal. He could not. Witnesses reportedly watched the color drain from his face as the instructions went on. His replies grew short. His attention wandered. After one final pause, the room was emptied and his doctors were summoned. Their message was blunt. The pace had to end. Charles was warned that carrying the full daily load of royal work could threaten his recovery. He was told to hand over most of his responsibilities at once and brace for a longer absence. That same evening, an emergency meeting was called at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Anne, and a small circle of constitutional advisors were summoned with no explanation given. Hi viewers! Are you happy Charles chose William and Catherine over Camilla? Comment yes or no below. And if you believe Camilla has held on to palace influence for long enough, do not just watch this story in silence. Like this video, share it with every royal supporter you know, and subscribe right now. Every like and every share tells YouTube to push this story forward, instead of allowing what happened inside the palace to disappear beneath another carefully written statement. If William and Catherine deserve your support, prove it before the next revelation. At the center of the table sat a sealed folder. Its title was plain, but its significance was colossal. The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. William initially assumed it covered little more than a handful of canceled engagements. Catherine expected a temporary reshuffle and stayed quiet. Charles opened the document and revealed that it moved state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the monarchy's long-term directions straight into William's hands. Then he turned toward Catherine. Under the order, she would take on duties normally reserved for the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, the royal household's public program, the visible work that shows Britain, the Commonwealth, and the wider world who now occupies the center of royal life. Catherine did not answer right away. She understood that accepting the position would reshape how every single future appearance was read. William pushed back. He told Charles the country might conclude he had engineered the transition himself. Catherine warned that standing beside a ceremonial throne while the king was still recovering could be spun as raw ambition. Charles would not allow them to shoulder that blame. He said the decision belonged to him, and that the institution could no longer be shielded by pretending his strength was unchanged. But Charles had one more concern. Before the meeting could move on, Anne laid a second folder beside the first. Inside it were confidential notes from members of Camilla's household. The papers reportedly explored how Camilla might preserve her authority if Charles stepped away, how her office could keep its grip on ceremonies, appointments, and the palace program, and how William's control could be framed as merely temporary. William read the first page twice. Catherine sat motionless, but the message was impossible to overlook. While Charles had been straining to keep up his duties, Camilla's household had already been talking about the power that might stay in her hands. William and Catherine had never been included in those conversations. Charles had never signed off on them. Anne had intercepted them before the plan could go any further. The health crisis had forced Charles to step aside. The secret notes forced him to decide who would truly rule next. William held his gaze on the first page, then moved to the second. The wording was cautious. Nothing in it sounded openly defiant. Nowhere did anyone use the word power, yet every sentence leaned in one direction. Camilla's household had been getting ready for Charles's absence before William had even been told how serious that absence might become. The notes outlined an advisory arrangement run from Clarence House. It would let Camilla's office review ceremonial plans, suggest changes to the royal diary, and stay involved in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph went further, proposing that William's expanded authority be labeled temporary, even if Charles stayed away for months. That sentence transformed the room. William demanded to know who had written it. Anne flipped to another page and pointed to a list of names. Senior members of Camilla's office, private secretaries, household advisors. Charles read through the names in silence. He had never approved the meeting. He had never asked for the proposal, and no one had told him his wife's household was already planning how to keep its influence after he stepped back. Catherine stayed composed, but her focus drifted to the margins. Handwritten remarks had been scribbled alongside the proposals. One suggested that major ceremonial decisions should require consultation with the Queen's office. Another cautioned against letting Kensington Palace become the sole center of authority during the King's recovery. Beneath the courteous phrasing, the message was unmistakable. William could carry the weight, but Camilla meant to keep a hand on the wheel. Anne explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide grew uneasy. The concern had been dressed up as continuity, stability, experience. Palace language could make almost anything sound harmless. Charles closed the folder and asked whether Camilla knew about the proposal. Anne said the discussions had run through her household, though the documents did not show how much Camilla had personally approved. William glanced toward the door. Charles stopped him. This could not turn into a confrontation in a corridor, not with staff moving through Buckingham Palace and reporters tracking every shift in the royal schedule. Camilla would be summoned privately and given the chance to explain herself. The meeting paused for 20 minutes. William walked into a neighboring room overlooking the palace gardens. His anger had not vanished. It had hardened. Catherine followed and reminded him the papers were dangerous precisely because they looked so reasonable. A public accusation would let Camilla's office deny everything and paint William as impatient for the crown. He understood, and that made it worse. When Camilla walked in, Charles stayed seated at the head of the table. Anne kept the folder shut. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat across from the chair prepared for Camilla. No raised voices greeted her. The silence said enough. Charles asked whether her household had discussed an advisory council operating out of Clarence House after his withdrawal. Camilla hesitated, then said, responsible staff had weighed several possibilities. She framed it as preparation, not ambition. A monarchy facing uncertainty, she argued, could not afford to throw away experience. William did not cut in. Camilla went on. She had stood beside Charles through years of public pressure. She knew the diplomatic calendar, the ceremonial machinery, the personalities inside the royal household. Stripping her office from every major decision would not produce stability. It would produce disruption. Then she made her request. The order should be amended. Camilla proposed a formal position that would let her keep influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the public program. William would handle constitutional business. Catherine could represent the crown at his side, but Camilla's household would stay involved wherever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were concerned. It sounded like a compromise. It was not. Catherine asked a single question. Who would make the final call when William and Camilla disagreed? Camilla answered that Charles's wishes should guide them. Charles looked down at the unsigned order. His absence was the entire reason the arrangement existed. Yet Camilla's proposal still relied on him settling disputes from private rooms while he recovered. The burden would creep back through phone calls, competing instructions, and appeals for intervention. Anne opened the folder and slid one page toward him. It described William's authority as reversible. That word ended the conversation. Charles told Camilla that no amendment creating a second court or weakening the heir's authority would be made. Camilla's expression shifted. She turned to William and asked whether this was what he wanted. William replied that he had not written the order. Charles had. Camilla walked out without accepting the decision. The door shut quietly behind her, but no one mistook that calm for surrender. Charles then put to the constitutional advisor the question everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's household challenge the order once it was signed? The advisor studied the final page and said there was one way to make certain they never could. He did not answer straight away. He pulled the unsigned order closer, examined the final clause, then looked toward Charles. A transfer of duties, he explained, could be attacked through interpretation. A household might claim consultation rights. An aide might stall an appointment. A contested instruction could be sent back for clarification. None of those moves would overturn William's authority, but each one could slow it, chip away at it, and drag the king back into the very struggle he was trying to escape. Charles understood. This was no longer about whether William could carry the workload. It was about whether anyone would be permitted to obstruct him while pretending to protect the crown. The mood in the room changed. William stepped away from the fireplace and sat opposite his father. His anger had cooled into something heavier. He told Charles he would not accept authority built on public humiliation. He would not stand before the country as if illness had become an opening. If the announcement went ahead, it had to preserve the king's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping aside was not surrender, he said. It was a choice made before weakness let others choose for him. Catherine asked how the transition would be presented. Her concern was clarity. The country could not be shown one arrangement while the palace quietly operated under another. If William was expected to lead, the public program had to reflect it. If Catherine was expected to take on the Queen's visible duties, no private office could quietly rewrite her decisions. Anne watched Charles carefully. He had spent years juggling affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now every compromise circled back to the same problem. Camilla wanted recognition for standing beside him. William needed unquestioned authority as heir. Catherine needed protection from claims she had seized something that was not hers. The monarchy needed one voice. Only one of those needs could govern the order. The advisors set about revising the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were stripped out. State audiences would pass straight to William. Senior palace appointments would need his approval. Long-term planning would shift under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the royal household. Anne would remain the bridge, not the ruler, not the rival, the witness. For nearly an hour, Charles read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than anyone expected. The answers grew less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement could not stay temporary forever, simply because no one wanted to name what came next. The crown could not live inside a pause. Charles reached the final page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it sat the fountain pen his private secretary had prepared. William expected him to sign. Catherine expected another delay. Anne noticed his hand move away from the signature line toward the blank space below the last clause. He began to write, slowly. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household. One sentence changed the meaning of everything before them. William read it once, then again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement. It was a barrier. Charles had not simply transferred responsibility to his son. He had blocked the office most likely to contest how that responsibility would be used. Catherine looked toward Anne. Anne showed no sign of surprise, but her stillness betrayed that she grasped the scale of what had just happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own handwriting. That mattered. Typed language could be blamed on advisors. Legal phrasing could be waved away as routine. A handwritten sentence from the king could not be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. Hi, viewers. If Charles was right to stop Camilla's household from interfering, do not let this moment pass quietly. Like the video, share it with someone who supports William and Catherine, and subscribe now. When viewers stay silent, Palace Spin wins. When thousands respond together, YouTube has no choice but to push the story further. Charles signed beneath the sentence. Anne signed as witness. William laid his hand on the document, but did not lift it. For a few seconds, father and son stayed on opposite sides of the table, aware that the paper between them had changed far more than the royal diary. It had changed the center of power. A secretary came in, sealed the copies, and asked where the first should be delivered. Charles answered without hesitation, Clarence House. Camilla received it before the announcement had even been drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and froze. Then she called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace was over. The fight over what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff braced for fury. What they witnessed instead was control. She placed the copied order on a table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. No one spoke. The words were too direct. They left no room for negotiation, no quiet path back into palace decisions, and no chance to claim that William's authority still depended on her approval. Camilla asked whether the sentence could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor chose his words carefully. The king had written it himself. The seal had been applied. Anne had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require Charles to reopen the order. Camilla grasped the problem. Charles had shut the door before she could reach it. Her private secretary suggested she appear beside him anyway. A united image might preserve the influence the document had stripped away. Camilla rejected the idea. Standing beneath the palace cameras while William and Catherine were presented as the monarchy's new center would look like consent. Worse, it would turn her into a witness at her own exclusion. She would not hand them that picture. Across London, Buckingham Palace moved with unusual speed. Communications officers drafted the statement. Ceremonial staff measured out positions in the throne room. Security teams reworked arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the country about the future conduct of royal duties. The language was chosen with care. Charles was not abdicating. William was not being crowned. Catherine was not being declared queen. Yet every practical detail pointed toward the same reality. Authority was moving. Public responsibility was moving. The visible weight of the crown was moving with it. The palace statement would call it continuity. The room would call it succession. Charles insisted on appearing first. Advisors wanted a written announcement released through official channels, but he refused to let illness speak on his behalf. He would look into the cameras, explain the decision, and make it clear that William had not demanded it. That mattered to him more than anyone realized. William had spent years preparing to inherit the crown, but preparation was not desire. Charles knew how quickly the public could twist duty into ambition. One photograph of William near the throne, one badly chosen phrase, one hint that Catherine looked too comfortable, and the transition could be recast as a family takeover. So Charles would carry the blame. He approved a short address stating that his recovery required a reduction in duties. He would confirm that William was assuming responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would name Catherine as the person overseeing major ceremonial functions and the household's public program. Then he added a line the advisors had not prepared.
The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows.
No one asked him to remove it. At Clarence House, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left blank. A place remained open near Charles during the opening statement, but no role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision-maker. That distinction cut deeper than any public insult. Camilla sent one final message to Buckingham Palace. She asked whether Charles would reconsider the restriction on her household if she appeared beside him. The reply came 20 minutes later. The order stood as signed. Camilla canceled her car. Outside Buckingham Palace, broadcasters went live. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first images showed senior officials entering through a side entrance, followed by Anne, then William, and Catherine. Camilla was missing. Rumors ignited immediately. Some claimed illness, others suggested a private dispute. Palace officials repeated the same phrase, a family matter. Inside, Charles waited in a private room with the original order beside him. William arrived first, Catherine followed. Anne stood by the window watching the courtyard below fill with cameras. Charles looked exhausted, but his voice held steady. He told William the announcement would change the public's understanding of their relationship. From that moment, every decision would be scanned for signs of conflict. Every absence would spawn a theory. Every appearance would be treated as a declaration. William answered that he would honor the reign already in progress. Catherine said nothing. She was staring at the two ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors. One bore William's place, the other bore hers. A palace aide entered and confirmed Camilla would not attend. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then gave the order to begin. The cameras went live, the palace doors opened, and before Charles spoke a single word, Britain saw who had chosen to stand beside the future and who had chosen to stay away. Charles entered the prepared room alone. For several seconds, he stood behind the lectern in silence. The cameras had caught the strain around his eyes. No palace statement could hide it. He looked determined, but the effort it took to remain there was plain to see. Then he began. He told the country that duty sometimes demands a person recognize the difference between endurance and service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily weight of the crown, and the institution required leadership that could act without hesitation. He named William. The words were measured, but their meaning traveled through London, Westminster, and every newsroom following the address. William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-range direction of the royal household. The arrangement would begin immediately. Then Charles named Catherine. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the crown. Her role would not be decorative. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show the country who now carried its public burden. The room stayed silent. Charles did not mention Camilla. That omission struck harder than any criticism could have. He thanked those who had supported him through his treatment. He spoke of continuity, family, and the future. But the woman who had stood beside him through his reign was absent from both the room and the transfer of authority. At Clarence House, Camilla watched the address with two staff members. She did not speak when William's name was announced. She did not move when Catherine's new responsibilities were listed. Only when Charles finished without naming any continuing role for her did she reach for the copy of the order again. The handwritten sentence waited near the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He did not smile. He approached his father, bowed his head, and promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. The moment was carefully controlled. The emotion was not. Charles placed one hand on William's arm, then released it quickly, as though holding on any longer might reveal too much. Catherine joined them a few steps later. She wore no crown, no tiara, no symbol suggesting celebration. Her expression carried the weight of the decision more than any speech could. Anne watched from the edge of the room. She had seen constitutional moments dressed up as pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no music, no sense of victory, only a family trying to turn a private collapse in confidence into a public image of order. Then Charles left. The cameras remained. William and Catherine turned toward the throne room, where the two ceremonial chairs had been positioned beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together, slowly enough for every broadcaster to capture the image across the United Kingdom. The symbolism was immediate. This was not a coronation, but it looked like the beginning of something that could not easily be reversed. William stopped before the first chair. Catherine stood beside the second. Neither sat at once. For one suspended moment, they remained standing, aware the country was watching them inherit responsibility before it inherited a new monarch. Then William took his place. Catherine followed. The picture spread across television screens and phones within minutes. Commentators debated whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described it as necessary stability. Critics questioned how temporary the transfer could be when the ceremony had been designed to present William and Catherine as the monarchy's next center. One question dominated every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials repeated that her absence concerned a private family matter. The phrase satisfied no one. Reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already learned her car had been canceled before the address. Others discovered that no future ceremonial role for her appeared anywhere in the public briefing. The explanation began to unravel. Inside Clarence's house, Camilla ordered the television switched off. She had expected Charles to reduce his schedule. She had not expected him to make William's authority visible in front of the world. She had certainly not expected Catherine to assume duties Camilla believed should remain attached to her position. Her title had not been removed. Her influence had. After the cameras left, a private secretary handed William the signed order, rather than the public copy. He examined the final page and noticed something he had missed during the meeting. Charles had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone attempting to challenge William would have to pass that sentence before ever reaching the king's signature. It was not an afterthought. It was the point. William carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the cameras had gone. The noise outside Buckingham Palace continued, but inside, the building felt emptied of ceremony. Charles was waiting near the window. Catherine stood beside a table covered with briefing papers. Anne remained by the door, holding the second sealed folder no one had yet discussed. William placed the order before his father. He asked one question. Was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? Charles did not answer at once. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the one line that had transformed a medical arrangement into a boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had left unsaid. His doctors had forced him to reduce the workload. Camilla's private preparations had forced him to decide where authority ended. Without that sentence, every decision could have become a negotiation. An appointment made by William could have been questioned at Clarence's house. A state banquet planned by Catherine could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until Charles intervened. The king would have stepped away in public while continuing to settle disputes in private. That was not recovery. That was another form of captivity. Charles told William he had spent too many years believing personal loyalty could be balanced against institutional clarity. This time, there could be no blurred line, no rival office, no second court operating through friendship, access, or habit. William listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to change. His father had not written the restriction to embarrass Camilla. He had written it because he knew how quickly uncertainty could become control. Catherine understood the cost more quietly. Charles had protected their authority, but in doing so, he had exposed the fracture inside his own household. The public would see a careful transition. The family would remember the argument behind it. Anne finally moved from the door. She said the sentence would be studied for years because it revealed the moment Charles stopped trying to satisfy everyone. As king, he had chosen one line of command. As a husband, he had accepted the consequence. At Clarence's house, Camilla was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained, her staff remained, her rooms, engagements, and private charities remained. Yet the machinery that gave those things influence had shifted away from her. Decisions would now leave William's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry Catherine's approval. Appeals to Charles would no longer reopen what had been settled. Camilla had not lost everything. She had lost the part that mattered most, the ability to shape what happened next. By evening, the image of William and Catherine beneath the royal insignia had traveled across Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics called it a soft transfer. Palace officials refused both descriptions. They repeated that Charles remained king and that the arrangement protected continuity. But symbols speak when statements refuse to. 2 chairs had been prepared. 2 names had been announced. 1 household had been excluded. Charles asked William for one final promise. The transition must not become a campaign against Camilla. No public retaliation, no deliberate humiliation, no attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed, but the promise carried a limit. Respect would not mean surrendering authority. Catherine supported that line. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but she would not be permitted to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement. Cold, clear, final. Hi viewers, if William and Catherine were right to accept this responsibility, comment ready below. Then like, share, and subscribe, because viewers who support this change cannot expect YouTube to push the story while they watch silently. Every share places this moment before another royal watcher. Every subscription makes it harder for the most important palace decisions to disappear behind carefully chosen words. Anne then placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles looked at it and asked whether it could wait. Anne said it could not. The cover carried a short title, Queen's Household, privileges, and residences after the transition. Inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties Camilla could continue using while Charles remained away from public life. One page concerned Clarence House, another concerned Buckingham Palace, but the final page carried a handwritten note beside Camilla's name. It identified the exact date her unrestricted palace access could end, and it had been approved before the throne room announcement began. Camilla had not seen it. William had not seen it. And when Anne opened that final page, even Charles appeared unprepared for what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years, but in days. That document and the single residence Camilla could be ordered to leave first is where the next story begins.